Chapter 2 of Masters of the Vortex by E. E. Smith. Chapter 2 Cloud Blasts a Vortex. Number 1, the oldest and worst vortex on Tellus, had been pushed out into the Badlands, and there, at 8 o'clock of the indicated morning, Cloud started to work on it. The lookout shack was in fact a fully equipped nucleonics laboratory. Its staff was not large. 8 men worked in 3 staggered 8-hour shifts, but the development of its instrumentation had required hundreds of man-years of intensive research. Every factor of the vortex's activity was measured and recorded continuously, throughout every minute of every day of every year, and all of these measurements were summed up, integrated into the sigma curve. This curve, which to the layman's eye was only a senselessly zigzagging line, told the expert everything he wanted to know. Cloud glanced at the chart and scowled, for one jagged peak, less than half an hour old, almost touched the top line of the paper. Bad, huh, Frank? Bad, Storm, and getting worse. I wouldn't wonder if Calamity were right. It certainly looks like she's getting ready to blow her top. No equation, I suppose, Strong said. The Lensmen ignored as completely as did the observer, if not as flippantly, the distinct possibility that at any moment the observatory and all that it contained might be resolved into their subatomic components. None, Cloud stated. He did not need to spend hours at a calculating machine. At one glance he knew, without knowing how he knew, that no equation could fit that wildly shifting sigma curve. But most of those recent cycles cut ordinate 750, so I'll take that for my value. That means 9.960 kilograms of duodec for my basic, and 9462 and 10.358 as alternates. On the wire? It went out as you said it, the observer replied. They'll be here in 5 minutes. QX. I'll get dressed then. The lensman and one of the observers helped him into his cumbersome, heavily padded armor. Then all 3 men went out to the flitter. A tiny speedster, really, a slim torpedo with the stubby wings and the ludicrous tail surfaces, the multifarious driving, braking side top and underjets, so characteristic of the tricky, cranky, but ultra-maneuverable breed. Cloud checked the newly installed Tripex launcher, made sure that he knew which bomb was in each tube, and climbed into the tiny operating compartment. The massive door, flitters are too small to have airlocks, rammed shut upon its Teflon gaskets. The heavy toggles drove home. A heavily padded form closed in upon the pilot, leaving only his left arm and his right leg free to move. Cloud shot the flitter into the air and toward the seething inferno which was loose atomic vortex number 1. The crater was a ragged, jagged hole perhaps 2 miles from lip to lip and a quarter of a mile in depth. The floor, being largely molten, was almost level except for a depression at the center, where the actual vortex lay. The walls of the pit were steeply, unstably irregular, varying in pitch and shape with the refractoriness of the strata composing them. Now a section would glare into an unbearably blinding white, puffing away in sparkling vapor. Again cooled by an inrushing blast of air, it would subside into an angry scarlet, its surface crawling into a sluggish flow of lava. Occasionally a part of the wall might even go black, into pockmarked scoriae or brilliant plains of obsidian. For always, at some point or another, there was a torrent of air rushing into that crater. It rushed in as ordinary air. It came out, however, in a ragingly uprushing pillar as something else. No one knows exactly what a vortex does to air, or rather the composition of the effluent gases varies as frequently and as unpredictably as does the activity of the vortex. Thus, the atmosphere emitted from a vortex crater may be corrosive, it may be poisonous, it may be merely different, but is no longer the air which we human beings are used to breathing. This conversion and corruption of Earth's atmosphere, if it could not be stopped, would end the possibility of life upon the planet's surface long before the world itself could be consumed. As to the vortex itself, it is difficult indeed to describe such a phenomenon. Practically all of its frightful radiation lies in those octaves of the spectrum which are invisible to the human eye. Suffice it to say, then, that it was a continuously active atomic reactor, with an effective surface temperature of approximately 25,000 degrees Kelvin, and let it go at that. Neal Cloud, driving his flitter through that murky, radiation-riddled atmosphere, extrapolating his sigma curve by the sheer power of his mathematical prodigy's mind, sat appalled. For the activity level was, and even in its lower dips remained, well above the figure he had chosen. Distant though he was from the rim of that hellish pit, his skin began to prickle and to burn. His eyes began to smart and to ache. He knew what those symptoms meant. Even the flitter's powerful screens were leaking. Even his suit screens and his special goggles were not stopping the stuff. But he wouldn't quit yet. The activity might, probably would, take a nosedive any second now. If it did, he'd have to be ready. On the other hand, it might blow up any second, too. There were two schools of mathematical thought upon that point. One held that a vortex without any essential change in its nature or behavior would keep on growing bigger until, uniting with the other vortices of the planet, it had converted all the mass of the world into energy. The second school, of which the aforementioned Calamity Carlwitz was the loudest voice, taught that at a certain stage of development the internal energy of the vortex would become so great that generation, radiation, and equilibrium could not be maintained. This would of course result in an explosion, the nature and consequences of which this Carlwitz was wont to dwell upon in ghoulishly mathematical glee. Neither school could prove its point, however, or rather each school proved its point with eminently plausible mathematics, and each hated and derided the other with heat and at length. Neal Cloud, as he studied through his almost opaque defenses that indescribably ravening fireball, that rapacious monstrosity which might very well have come from the very center of the hottest hell of mythology, felt strangely inclined to agree with Carlwitz. It didn't seem possible that it could get any worse without exploding. The activity stayed high, way too high. The tiny control room grew hotter and hotter. His skin burned more and his eyes ached worse. He touched a stud and spoke. "Phil, better get me 3 more bombs like these, except up around—" "I don't check you. If you do that, it's apt to drop to a minimum and stay there. I'd suggest a wider interval." "QX, that'd be better. 2 then, instead of 3. 4.980 and 13.940. You might break out a jar of burn dressing, too. Some fairly warm stuff is leaking through." "Will do. Come down, fast." Cloud landed. He stripped to the skin, and his friends smeared him with the thick, gooey stuff that was not only added protection against radiation, but also a sovereign remedy for new burns. He exchanged his goggles for a heavier, darker pair. The 2 bombs arrived and were substituted for 2 of the original load. "I thought of something while I was up there," Cloud said then. 14 kilograms of duodec is nobody's firecracker, but it may be the least of what's going to go off. Have you got any idea what's going to become of the intrinsic energy of the vortex when I snuff it?" "Can't say I have," the Lensman frowned in thought. "No data." "Neither have I, but I'd say you better go back to the new station, the one you were going to move to if it kept on getting worse. The clocks are ticking there, aren't they?" "Yes, it might be a smart thing to do, just in case." Again in air, Cloud found that the activity, while still very high, was not too high for his heaviest bomb, but that it was fluctuating too rapidly. He could not get even 5 seconds of trustworthy prediction, to say nothing of 10, so he waited, as close to the horrible center of disintegration as he dared. The flitter hung poised in air, motionless, upon softly hissing underjets. Cloud knew to a fraction his height above the ground. He knew to a fraction his distance from the vortex. He knew the density of the atmosphere and the velocity and direction of the wind. Hence, since he could also read, closely enough, the momentary variations in the cyclonic storms within the crater, he could compute very easily the course and velocity necessary to land the bomb in the exact center of the vortex at any given instant of time. The hard part, the thing that no one had as yet succeeded in doing, was to predict for a time far enough ahead to be of any use a usably close approximation to the vortex's quantitative activity. Therefore Cloud concentrated upon the dials and gauges in front of him, concentrated with every fiber of his being and with every cell of his brain. Suddenly, almost imperceptibly, the sigma curve gave signs of flattening out. Cloud's mind pounced. Simultaneous differential equations, 9 of them. A quadruple integration in 4 dimensions. No matter. Cloud did not solve problems laboriously, one operation at a time. Without knowing how he arrived at it, he knew the answer. Just as the Ponesian or the Rigellian can perceive every separate component particle of an opaque, 3-dimensional solid, without being able to explain to any Tyrrellian how his sense of perception works. It just is, that's all. By virtue of whatever sense or ability it is which makes a mathematical prodigy what he is, Cloud knew that in exactly 7 3/10 seconds from that observed instant, the activity of the vortex would match precisely the rating of his heaviest bomb. Another flick of his mental switch, and he knew exactly the velocity he would require. His hands swept over the studs, his right foot tramped down hard upon the firing pedal, and even as the quivering flitter rammed forward under 5 Tyrrellian gravities of acceleration, he knew to the thousandth of a second how long he would have to hold that acceleration to attain that velocity. While not really long, in seconds, it was much too long for comfort. It would take him much closer to the vortex than he wanted to be. In fact, it would take him almost to the crater's rim. But he stuck to the calculated course, and at the precisely correct instance he released his largest bomb and cut his dive. Then, in a continuation of the same motion, his hands slashed down through the beam of light whose cutting would activate the Bergen hold and make the vessel inertialess, safe from any form whatever of physical violence. For an instant nothing happened, and for that instant Cloud sat appalled. Neutralization of inertia took time. Not that he had ever been told it was instantaneous. He had just assumed so. He had never noticed any time lapse before, but now it seemed to be taking forever. After that one instant of shocked inaction, he went into ultra-speed action, kicking in the little vessel's all-out 8G drive and whirling her around as only a flitter or a speedster can whirl, only to see in his plate the vortex opening up like a bellflower, or like a sun going nova. Cloud's forebodings were more than materialized then, for it was not only the bomb that was going off. The staggeringly immense energy of the vortex was merging with that of the detonating duodec to form an utterly indescribable explosion. In part the flood of incandescent lava in the pit was beaten downward by the sheer stupendous force of the blow. In part it was hurled abroad in masses, gouts, and streamers, and the raging blast of the explosion's front seized the fragments and tore and worried them to bits, hurling them still faster along their paths of violence. And air, so densely compressed as to act like a solid, smote the walls of the crater. Those walls crumbled, crushed outward through the hard-packed ground, broke up into jaggedly irregular blocks which hurtled screamingly in all directions. The blast wave or explosion front buffeted the flyer while she was still partially inert, and while Cloud was almost blacked out and physically helpless from the frightful linear and angular accelerations. The impact broke his left arm and his right leg, the only parts of his body not pressure-packed. Then, milliseconds later, the debris began to arrive. Chunks of solid or semi-molten rock slammed against the hull, knocking off wings and control surfaces. Gobs of viscous slag slapped it liquidly, freezing into and clogging up jets and orifices. The little ship was knocked hither and thither by forces she could no more resist than can a floating leaf resist a cataract. Cloud's brain was addled as an egg by the vicious concussions which were hitting him so nearly simultaneously from so many different directions. The concussions and the sluggings lightened, stopped, a vast peace descended, blanket-wise. The flitter was free, was riding effortlessly away from the outermost, most tenuous fringes of the storm. Cloud wanted to faint. Then, but he didn't quite. With one arm and leg, and what few cells of his brain were still in working order, he was still in the fight. It did not even occur to him until long afterwards that he was not going to make any effort whatever to avoid death. Foggily he tried to look at the crater. 9/10 of his visiplates were dead, but he finally got a view. Good, it was out. He wasn't surprised. He knew it would be. His next effort was to locate the secondary observatory, where he would have to land, and in that, too, he was successful. He had enough intelligence left to realize that with practically all his jets clogged and his wings and tail shot off, he couldn't land his flitter inert. He'd have to land her free. Neal Cloud was not the world's best pilot. Nevertheless, by dint of light and somewhat unorthodox use of what few jets he had left, he did land her free. A very good landing, considering. He almost hit the observatory's field, which was only 1 mile square, and having landed her, he inerted her. But as has been intimated, his brain wasn't working quite so good. He had held his ship inertialess for quite a few seconds longer than he thought, and he did not even think of the terrific buffetings she had taken. As a result of those things, however, her intrinsic velocity did not match anywhere nearly that of the ground upon which she lay. Thus, when Cloud cut his Bergen home, restoring thereby to the flitter the absolute velocity and the inertia she had before going free, there resulted a distinctly anticlimactic crash. There was a last terrific bump as the motionless vessel collided with the equally motionless ground, and Storm Cloud Vortex Blaster went out like the proverbial light. Help came, of course, on the double. Cloud was unconscious, and the flitter's port could not be opened from the outside, but those were not insuperable obstacles. A plate already loose was torn away. The pilot was unclamped and rushed to base hospital, and the meat crate standing by. Later, in a private office of that hospital, the head of the Vortex Control Laboratory sat and waited, not patiently. "How is he, Lacey?" he demanded, as the Sergeant Marshal entered the room. "He's going to live?" "Oh, yes, Phil. Definitely yes," Lacey replied briskly. "A very good skeleton, very good indeed. His screens stopped all the really bad radiation, so the damage will yield quite readily to treatment. He doesn't really need the Phillips we gave him, for the replacement of damaged parts, you know, except for a few torn muscles and so on. But he was pretty badly smashed up. I helped take him out, you know. How about that arm and leg? He was a mess." "Merely simple fractures, entirely negligible." Lacey waved outside with an airy gesture, such minor ills as broken bones. "He'll be out in a couple of weeks." "How soon can I see him? Business can wait, but there's a personal matter that can't." "I know what you mean." Lacey pursed his lips. "Ordinarily I wouldn't allow it, but you see him now. Not too long, though, Phil. He's weak. 10 minutes at most." "QX, thanks." The nurse led the visiting Lensmen to Cloud's bedside. "Hi, Stoop," he boomed cheerfully. "Stoop being short for stupendous this time." "Ho, Chief. Glad to see somebody. Sit down." "You're the most wanted man in the galaxy, not excepting Kimball Kinnison. Here's a spool of tape, which you can look at as soon as Lacey will let you have a scanner. It's only the first one. As soon as any planet finds out that we've got a sure enough vortex blower outer who can really call his shots, and that news gets around mighty fast, it sends in a double urgent Class A prime demand for you. Sirius 4 got in first by a whisper, but it was a photo finish with Aldebaran 2, and all channels have been jammed ever since. Canopus, Vega, Rigel, Spica. Everybody from Elska Can to Zabriska. We announced right off that we wouldn't receive personal delegations. We had to almost throw a couple of pink-haired Chickaladorians out bodily to make them believe we meant it. That our own evaluation of necessity, not priority of requisition, would govern. QX? Absolutely, Cloud agreed. That's the only way to handle it, I should think. So forget this psychic trauma. No, I don't mean that. The Lensman corrected himself hastily. You know what I mean. The will to live is the most important factor in any man's recovery, and too many worlds need you too badly to have you quit now. Check? I suppose so, Cloud acquiesced, but somberly. And I've got more will to live than I thought I had. I'll keep on pecking away as long as I last. Then you'll die of old age, Buster, the Lensman assured him. We got full data. We know exactly how long it takes to go from fully inert to fully free. We know exactly what to do to your screens. Next time nothing will come through except light, and only as much of that as you like. You can wait as close to a vortex as you please, for as long as necessary, to get exactly the conditions you want. You'll be as safe as if you were in Clono's hip pocket. Sure of that? Absolutely, or at least as sure as we can be of anything that hasn't happened yet. But your guardian angel here is eyeing her clock a bit pointedly, so I'd better do a flip before she tosses me out on my ear. Clear ether, Storm. Clear ether, Chief. Thus Storm Cloud, nucleonicist, became the most narrowly specialized specialist in the long annals of science, became Storm Cloud, the Vortex Blaster. And that night, Lensman Philip Strong, instead of sleeping, thought and thought and thought. What could he do, what could anybody do, if Cloud should get himself killed? Somebody would have to do something, but who and what? Could or could not another Vortex Blaster be found, or trained? And next morning early he lends the thought. Kinnison, Phil Strong, I've got a high priority problem that will take a lot of work and a lot more weight than I carry. Are you free to listen for a few minutes? I'm free. Go ahead. End of chapter 2.